and thank you for listening us here at the Let's Talk About Wargames podcast. I'm Jack, and with me, as always, today is Joe. Hey, Joe, how's it going?
Hi there. Doing pretty good today.
It is a Friday when we are recording this, the Friday before a 3-day weekend, and boy, I think we both have earned this weekend as everyone else listening to this podcast. First, today, we wanted to give a shout out to some people who gave us some just very good feedback and direction after the end of our last episode about the Second Sino-Japanese War. Please go listen to that if you haven't yet. It's very good. First, I want to shout out Jermaine from a Discord server that I'm in. He sent me over some interesting board games about the Second Sino-Japanese War that we missed. Both Joe and I are more PC focused than board game focused, I would say. Joe, you have a bit more of a board game bias than I do. I don't have a ton of people to do the hardcore war games with.
Yeah, I'm getting there. I'm expanding the collection as we go.
It's hard to board game during social distancing, but I think we did talk about setting up a vassal module so we can try out some of these at some point. So thank you, Jermaine, for those. Those were very helpful. I'll see if I can track some of those down and post those in the description for this episode. And also, I wanted to give another shout out to Kevin from the same server. He gave us some good background information on the Japanese government around the point in time of the Second Sino-Japanese War, more towards the end of it, and American involvement in Japan afterwards, which was very interesting. It's some interesting stuff there, and I'll also post a link to the things that he forwarded over to me just for posterity's sake. It's an interesting read.
On my end, I want to thank Heathwill, or Hethwill, sorry, from the Hex Discord, who provided a small correction about the start date of the Flying Tigers, who the American Air Forces in China, who only started fighting as the Flying Tigers after the war started for the Americans. I placed it earlier than that, and that was a mistake on my part. So thanks for that, to correct that. And also
Can't win them all.
Yeah. And also thanks to Eric of the Internet for consistently commenting on our Let's Play videos and keeping us in check there.
Oh yes, we are accountable to this one man, and we appreciate you, Eric. We appreciate you so much. All right, so today's topic, as you can see from our header up above, down below, wherever you're finding this podcast, is going to be Total War Shogun 2. In my opinion, the best Total War game that's come out. I don't know if you agree with me on that, Joe. Do you agree with me? Is it the best Total War game?
We could do that. We'd make this episode just about that, rank of the Total War games. No. It's very high on my list. I put a lot of time into it. I liked it a lot. And honestly, if you can picture dumpy little child Joe, Shogun Total War 1 was one of the things that put me down the academic path I went. So I've got a strong connection to the Total War Shogun games. And disclaimer right here at the beginning, even though I'm going to be harsh on some things in that game, I still love it dearly, and I don't mean to think it's a bad game in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah. What we're going to be talking about today is the authenticity of the game, but also the historical accuracy of the game, versus how it plays as a game. So, for those of you who have played a Total War game before, you probably already have an idea of where this is going, just because you'll load up a Total War game, say a Rome 2 Total War or a Three Kingdoms Total War. It's called Total War Three Kingdoms. They reversed the titles recently. It shows you how long I've been playing the series. Three Kingdoms Total War, and you'll have units of just hundreds of men in perfect formations running at each other. And I don't know if there's many points in history where that was accurate. Certainly it was at some points during the time when the Romans were the hegemony in Europe. Certainly at some points during the pike and shot going into line infantry era in Europe. But other than that, I mean, it's not too common that you'll have people just lined up like that. And that's the kind of thing we wanted to talk about here today, is the feeling of Shogun 2 versus the accuracy of Shogun 2.
And I like that we separate it into the two terms of authenticity and accuracy. I've written about this before in terms of tabletop games, historical war games with miniatures, and how some games people tout as being accurate because they have a lot of mechanical depth, but other games people enjoy more or play more because they get the feeling of playing a particular battle, or participating, air quotes, in a certain conflict. So yeah, I think it's good if we actually hash out what we mean by these words. And of course, if you think we're being uh, incorrect with our definitions, I'd like to hear yours too in the comments. But for authenticity, I settled on the feeling of historical fiction. Does it feel right to you in your mind as you're experiencing it that this feels correct? And this has very little to do with reality, historical reality, or any concept of the historical past, because that's not what we will ever in the present experience, aside from direct footage and whatnot. All we are going to get is our uh, remembered and our popular understanding of what happened in the past, and that's always going to be a little different from the reality. But that doesn't mean it won't evoke certain feelings in us as we experience it. So when you're watching a World War II movie, what you're seeing is not what actually happened, but you're seeing how we as a, collective culture have perceived and accepted as correct as an experience of that war, right? And that's where authenticity comes in. And when we're talking with Shogun 2, and that's one of the reasons we picked Shogun 2, is that the whole concept of Sengoku Jidai, the Warring States period, and samurai has become so tied in with the popular perception of what that style of warfare and what these type of people were like, that it has, in many ways usurped the search for that, air quotes, accuracy. Now, on that line of thinking, if we talk about accuracy, mostly in popular terms, I see this referring to technical specifications. Is that gun ranged correctly? Does that man's uniform have the correct number of buttons and whatnot? Are the right people and units at the right battles? Are they performing the tactics that they should be performing as per the manuals that they had access to, or as per the general that is commanding them? Those are the kinds of things that people talking about with historical accuracy, and I think that's what comes up a lot more when you're looking at trolling through wargame forums or discussion boards, or chatting with people who are talking about pros and cons of games, is how accurate it is, right? And these are two very different things, but I think they get conflated a lot. People look for the accuracy in the physical in the game, and then try and equate that with authenticity. So if it's physically accurate, therefore it must be authentic, therefore it must feel like the correct thing. But I think those are two very different sides of the same coin, and we need to approach each of them individually. Does that make sense?
I sure think it does, but then again, I was the one who's talking to you about it. If you don't think it makes sense, please argue with us in the comments. But I side with Joe Foley on these on these definitions here. Authenticity versus accuracy, feeling versus reality. Another way we could put it, I guess. It is something that is interesting that the further back we go in history, the more authentic it could be, but the less accurate, because for people who like going back into history and seeing what it has to tell us about things, you'll notice that there's only a few firsthand accounts remaining of a lot of things going the further back you go. For a lot of the Roman period, there's Cassius Dio, and he's like the one source for like for a decent amount of the Roman histories, the Roman Empire's history. It's just Cassius Dio. Good luck finding anything else. And similarly with Japan and the Sengoku Jidai period, it's more recent and there are more sources, but there's a couple of stumbling blocks for us in the West to get an accurate understanding of what they are. The first thing is that, like the example of the Roman texts, there's not a ton of first-hand accounts left from the Sengoku Jidai period. And secondly, there's also the language barrier, which does inhibit a lot of people from finding more about this and making it super accurate.
Yep.
I know for a fact that Creative Assembly is the studio behind Total War, has flubbed things before because they just didn't have access to the correct text translations. I know in Total War 3 Kingdoms, the most recent one that came out, they just have a mountain in the wrong place. A very famous and important mountain is in the wrong part of China, just because they didn't have access to the firsthand historical accounts that would have been able to point out to them, no, it's over here.
See, and that brings up another point that we didn't plan on talking about, but I think it would be fun to interject and discuss it now a little bit. Why would they get that wrong? Because there are historians all over the world whose job is to make sure this stuff is done correctly. But there's a disconnect between the academic world and the game development world, especially in terms of that kind of historical accuracy, right? I know specifically, anecdotally, speaking to a professor who's an expert in the First World War, who tried to reach out to EA when they were doing Battlefield 1 and said, hey, I will work for free for you and I will make sure this is, air quotes, historically accurate. And they just ignored him. They got a famous YouTuber to do their historical research for them.
So, who is the YouTuber? I don't remember that.
Off the top of my head here. They did the World War One day by day series.
I don't remember who that was.
I mean, he has a degree and he does very good research, because I've watched some of those videos, and I'm not going to disparage him, but it's the idea that when they had a path to choose, they skipped the academic White Tower, right, and went to someone with popular appeal. And I can see that making sense from a business point of view, but it just is indicative of a wider, what's the word? Not disregard, but a split or a distance between the academic historical world and video games. On the one hand, coming from academia, I know a lot of people are trying to bridge that on that side, on the academic side, trying to make study of video games as important as, film studies or any other cultural studies. And then mathematically, and then the design side, there's a lot of academic discussion of game design and the mathematics and physics that go into it. But there's that real ka-chunk between academic history and popular history in terms of video games. And I think that's just part of the difficulty when you're dealing with games with history. And now, for me, the difficulty in the fact that many people are getting their history from interactive media, from video games, as a primary form of education. Because, we can get into all of it right now, but the world over, social science and arts funding is being cut in lots of education systems, and that includes history. So the amount of history people are getting access to is declining in education settings, but people still consume these products, right? So some places do hire historians or people with history degrees, but it's not nearly as high a number as I would like it to be.
Yeah, I have noticed that. I guess it is kind of a skew towards pop history, if you will, because that's what sells. A lot of these games aren't being made as educational tools; they're being made as marketable goods. And I don't want to get into this discussion of whether that's a good or a bad thing, because I like having fun. And I mean, the games are fun. I'm not going to talk crap about any of this stuff, but I can tell you that my love for history really got started with the first Battlefield 1942 was like the first probably historical game that I played. No, it was Medal of Honor Allied Assault was the first one I played. That was World War II. And that was my view of World War II for a long time. Similarly with Medieval 2 Total War, that was my first Total War game. That was my view of the medieval era. I was like, so there are 2 cities in England, like 3 cities in France. Okay, I understand now. And there's nothing wrong with that, but I think that part of what we're trying to do here today is just talk about the differences between those 2 things and how they culminated in Shogun 2. So without further delaying on our part here, I think we're about 15 minutes in, we haven't started talking about the game much yet. We'll get into this. We have a lot of points we want to talk about Shogun 2 today. It is a game both of us hold near and dear to our hearts. So let's get at it.
So, basics. For those who haven't played it, Shogun Total War II takes place during the Sengoku Jidai, which is the age of the country at war, mostly through the middle to late part of it, because there's a century plus of on and off conflict across the whole of Japan, where you have the central authority of the shogun diminishing, and people on the periphery, the local regional lords, daimyo, who have manpower, who have money, who have power, uh, taking it upon themselves to expand their holdings, expand their control, and eventually fight to unify the country again. And that's what Shogun 2 throws you into. You take control of one of these daimyo, one of these big names, and your job is to eventually try and reunify the country by seizing Kyoto and then defeating your rivals. And that was like, one of the historic goals of the warlords at the time was if you could seize Kyoto, that's where the emperor lives. Therefore, you can control the emperor. The emperor can make you shogun, and that would be the way to win it. So the game does that well, right? I mean, that's the general idea of the conflict, and the game does a good job of dealing with stuff like religion, because we have Christian traders coming in the south and bringing weapons and bringing Christianity, and that led to a lot of issues for 16th century and 17th century Japan. They also brought guns, which of course dramatically changed the face of warfare in Japan, because that was adopted. Once they figured out that guns were effective, they became the primary tool. So it's a very rapid shift in how war was being fought across the Japanese islands, which the game tries to reflect. If I remember when I'm playing, it's been a while since I played a proper game of Shogun 2, but the tempo aren't nearly as effective as I thought they should be when I was playing. Do you have an experience with them? Do you remember?
Which ones are the Teppo again? I mostly focused on the Shimazu, and I liked playing the Hattori, and I have a big soft spot for Oda Nobunaga, so I ended up playing the Oda a lot.
Oh no,
I don't remember the Teppo.
Teppo is just an arquebus, or like a
The
musket.
Arquebus. Oh yeah, yeah. I generally didn't get that far in the campaign. In the base game, either I got wiped out, or I kind of just blitzed it and won before I got to the Arquebus period. I know that you could import, if you were Christian, you could import Portuguese tercios, which
Oh,
is
really? I think I
yeah.
missed that
I think they
expansion.
even call them tercios in the game. It's either tercios or something similar. I remember seeing a video of someone playing Shogun 2 recently, and they were there. I was like, I don't remember this at all, but they're definitely there.
Well, so it appears there's been some updates to the game since I've last played it. But of course, we can, put that to bed. There was no Portuguese ground forces in the Japanese islands during this. That's kind of funny, though. Right, but my point was that the game does try to model at the big scale, the macro scale, a lot of the turmoil and interesting ebb and flow of cultural influences on the islands, and I thought that was really great. But agents are a good way to start looking at this. A lot of the things that they have as like playable agents in the game, and in Total War you have your armies and your generals, and also have agents, which are usually individual figures that run around the map and do things for you. Like you have ninja or whatnot that you can run around to set fire to things and assassinate people. A lot of those agents aren't really historically accurate, but you wouldn't think so because of the way they look and feel. Like they have geisha running around as assassins, right?
Yeah.
And geishas are like a product of the urbanization that happened at the end, the latter bit of the Sengoku Jidai and into the Edo period, when you have people moving into cities around the castles, and you start requiring a large shift towards like urban culture, like tea houses and gambling and geishas, and they're not really running around the same way they would be 50, 60 years earlier, like the game portrays. Same with, you get secret police. I forget what the game calls them, but you have secret police units that run around, and those are Edo constructions. Those are, from the next stage after the Civil Wars ended. The secret police were repressionary tools for the Edo government, but they're still in the game. But they don't feel too off because a lot of the like pop culture icons we have dealing with that period, like if we look at films like the Kira Kurosawa movies and whatnot, those Chanbara sword fighting movies that people are really into, those tend to take place in an Edo setting. So they have things like secret police running around and geishas running around. It just becomes part of our cultural, image of Japan.
Right.
So
it's one of those things that, historically speaking, it makes sense that we wouldn't get that. I'm not sure. I can't speak from the Japanese perspective how egregious that would be to a Japanese person playing the game. But to us, it feels right because we don't generally have a spot-on knowledge of exactly when these things happened in Japan, as of Western society. It's kind of like if you didn't know American history very well and someone put George Washington at Jamestown running around with a musket, no one would probably think that was too weird because it's a similar enough period. If you weren't super familiar with American history, you'd be like, yeah, George Washington, America started, sure.
Yeah,
it's kind of like that.
I feel the an easy analogy is just even our own understanding of Western medieval history. Like we have a very like the popular image that dominates that is knights and chivalry, maidens, and horses and shining plate armor, all that kind of stuff, right? But that really wasn't the reality for knighthood or medieval life, right? But it's the same thing in Japan, where you have this very idealized understanding of the Sengoku Jidai, and that in itself is a product of the Edo period and the 19th century, if we want to get into that later on. But anecdotally, my own experience in Japan with people, talking to people, going to festivals and all that, it's the same kind of idea, right? They have a very idealized version of these heroes, these larger than life figures during this period, like Oda Nobunaga and Toyotomi Hideyoshi and the rest of them, right? Like
the whole gang.
Yeah, the whole wonderful warlord. I mean, on my desk, I have 3 figurines of cats, one for each of the unifiers that I picked up at a festival, and they're just staring at me while I disparage them on the internet. But no, it's okay. Oda Nobunaga's been with me for a while.
Oh no.
Oh yes, and that was a big thing. But you see, it's an example of how that exists over there for them, right? It's pop culture. It's just part of the pop understanding of history. So I don't know off the top of my head if a Japanese person playing this game would be altogether too pissed off to see a geisha or a metsuke, that's the secret police, running around in this game that is supposed to be of this period. Because again, that's what they're going for.
Do you think it would feel more authentic to a Japanese person if we had Oda Nobunaga in the game portrayed as a cat man?
I mean, I haven't gone looking at mods, but I'm pretty sure there'd be something like that floating around.
I would be surprised if there isn't an anime mod for Shogun 2 out there somewhere. It would fit really well. I would be surprised. They did it for CK2. They could do it for this game.
But yeah, also looking at like the feeling for us and how it looks, the art and sound. Like we have a lot of those, for lack of a better term, Hollywood signifiers of Japan in this game, right? You have cherry blossoms, you have the rolling hills, you have castles in the background. I'm talking about the menus and when you're panning across the map and all that. You've got that bamboo paper, black ink brush stroke kind of visual style to a lot of things. You've got some almost period accurate ukiyo-e style paintings in the back for a lot of things.
So those did seem pretty authentic. If I didn't know any better, I would have been like, wow, that's a really specific painting they got from history to put in the game.
Some of them I think are legit. They're just from later on. They're from the Edo period, when people are again projecting their own ideas of what warfare is back to a period of their fathers and grandfathers, which is going to be a bit different, right?
Well, everyone does it, so
yeah,
but
it's interesting that's how they do it. Like, and even sound wise, it has a lot of those, again, signifiers that this is Japan, right? Like I'm pretty sure there are a few things where you hear that someone yelling "yo" in the background, and that's
Oh
like
yeah.
a no theater signaler, right, for people to keep time and all that. But it's just become such a thing where if you see any TV show or movie where they're talking about Japan, someone's going "yo" in the background at some point, right? And it works into the cultural zeitgeist of how we understand these periods of history, and these quick signifiers let people feel more in line with what they're looking at and what they're feeling, right? So they're
Oh
hitting all the
yeah.
right bars.
Yeah, and I do want to bring up the music for a second because I one of my favorite parts of Shogun 2 is the music. It's just so good. Because it's not all authentic Japanese instruments at the time. I don't know if any of them were at the time, but they really knocked it out of the park with the sound of it. Because if you've ever seen a samurai movie or anything like that, you know what Japan is supposed to sound like according to pop culture.
Hmm.
You know what those sounds are. You know what the Sengoku Jidai Japan sounds like, and the game really captures the hell out of that. It's got really good use of the taiko drums. Is that what they're called?
Hmm.
I
They're in
I
there.
think that yeah, they they bang the hell out of those things, and I love it. It's and I think they have like a string orchestra there, which obviously isn't accurate, but
Well, I'm not a
it
music
does.
historian. Like there are native Japanese string instruments and a lot of imported Chinese instruments that they had for a really long time, but I'm not comfortable enough saying like, oh yeah, those are in the Sengoku Jidai period because I'm just not a music historian. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that the instruments that are played during the game though are more like I hear like violins and cellos and stuff.
Mm.
It's not a very authentic thing. I don't think the Japanese imported violins were immediately like, let's just use these. So I don't think that's what would have happened. The Portuguese brought guns and spices, I think, and Christianity. I think that's what they brought. I don't think they brought violins. I don't think they bothered.
You know, and now I'm going to go look this up afterwards because I'm not sure. I don't know what's going on with the music scene because I'm not a music guy. I really don't know much about. I'm certainly not a like a player of music, so it'd be, yeah, I don't know. I don't think they had violins, but I can't definitely say it. I'm waiting for someone in the comments already poised to be like, well, actually, the first viceroy of the East India Company brought a violin and gave it to Nobunaga, and I just didn't heard of it or something like that. But you wait, something like that'll happen.
If someone is listening to this and you are a taiko drummer, please let us know. Uh,
You can do our intro
I,
theme.
I'm personally a big fan. Okay. um, and you know, in addition to the sound being authentic, if not accurate, I I mean, obviously we can't say how accurate it is. I don't think either of us have access to a list of time period accurate Japanese music pieces for the 1500s, but some things that we are able to state more definitively than the music and the art style of the game. I guess Joe, you might have a better handle on that. Would be the diplomatic measures that you can take in the game and the military actions you can take in the game. I would say that that's more of our forte than any of these other things that we've talked about.
Hmm. Yeah, again, diplomatically, if we're looking at the macro level of Total War, where you're on the map and you're dealing with other states and moving armies around, nothing there struck me as egregious. Like it seems like a lot of that stuff was happening. They have hostage exchanges. That was a very big thing that happened, right?
Yeah,
Where
that
you,
was a thing that happened a lot in the same era in Europe too. In a lot of these feudal states, they would exchange hostages to, you know, ensure that no one tried anything sneaky. You know, like give me your kid, I'll give you mine, and neither of us will declare war on the other upon threat of death to the child because no one wants that. No one
Mhm.
wants their heir killed.
Yeah, Tokugawa Ieyasu was a hostage child, and look at him now.
He's dead.
Well, yes, but he died, Shogun. So good for him.
Right.
Um, but yeah,
It didn't work out too well for him in the extremely long run, but the short run worked out pretty well.
yeah, he was so close to that, elixir of
The
immortality,
immortality.
but just
Yeah.
couldn't quite pull it off. Way to slip up, Tokugawa.
Way to go, Tokugawa.
But yeah, looking at other things like the way you form alliances, the vassalage systems, all of that seems, abstracted. Of course, it's a game, but the way like it seemed fine, and that feels authentic. But also, as far as I understand, in the technical sense of it, it's about as accurate as you can get working it into a game where you have to have consistent systems for players to interact with, so that the game doesn't feel shoddy. They even have that. I don't know, I forget the name of it, but it's like a great divide that happens in the game when you take Kyoto or when you get too powerful, and the rest of
I
the
think it's called the Realm Divide. I
oh,
think
there
that's
you
what
go.
it's called.
I wasn't too far off. But yeah, that's obviously very gamey to try and stop you from running away with it when you get super powerful, but it also reflects that kind of uh, understanding that these daimyo had, that if they wanted to, go for the gold, they had to secure Kyoto, and if someone was getting close to doing that, that was going to be a problem. So like when Oda Nobunaga secured Kyoto, uh, a lot of his enemies kind of coalesced into alliances to try and oust him there, right? So there was a that makes sense. That's important, and I appreciate that this stuff is happening. And again, we have Ninja floating around, so we could talk about Ninja for 6 hours if you wanted to.
Yeah, I want to point out as an relatively uneducated, relative to you, Joe, uh, observer of Ninja and fan of Ninja, that the ninja in the game, while also being out of time, it's very funny that they are portrayed as they are. You know, the guys running around in all black, because the idea of a ninja in all black going around and assassinating someone is specifically from the, as you mentioned earlier, Joe, the No Theater, because in the plays they would have someone dressed up in all black so you couldn't see them on the stage, and then they would appear and kill some guy because they're supposed to be sneaky and everything. And so the idea of a ninja wearing all black is actually a theatrical thing. In reality, they were more frequently, they would just use disguises and stuff to come up and assassinate someone, as you would think. I guess more like along the lines of a modern day assassin. You think of a CIA, KGB, whatever, like you're gonna have a good disguise and go kill someone. It was kind of the same deal for ninja. So it's just very funny. It's like if you pictured some CIA guy in the 60s in the middle of Soviet Russia trying to carry out some covert plan, and he's just wearing just an all black suit, or I don't know, what's a popular depiction of a CIA officer now, like some guy in like a Hawaiian shirt in the middle of Moscow. It would be like if that was what you saw.
Yeah, you're right. Like we have the theatrical version of the ninja, and I mean they were active. This is the time of the ninja. The Sengoku Jidai is when they did become, a force. And a lot of the time, they weren't like individuals running around in black pajamas stabbing people. They were a form of like self defense for peasant groups who decided they didn't want to be a part of this. And you have some of the famous ninja villages in Shigaken. See, I when I lived there, I lived just down the road from one of them, so I went to go visit a couple times. um,
Are you a ninja, Joe?
nope, but they did try and get me to throw stars, and I didn't do it because I felt
Why
awkward
not?
enough. I don't know. It was I was there for
Yeah,
the ancient buildings, not the tourist trap stuff.
I guess as the Westerner there, if I don't know, I think they were like trying to gotcha you, like, oh look, the Westerner, get him to throw ninja stars. This will be hilarious.
Yeah, it's very much a tourist thing now, right? They had a bunch of kids running around and they're showing like, oh, here's the secret floors and stuff. And I don't know how much of that is entirely accurate, but I know that that area was, this a tiny center of resistance to the entire conflict, right? You protect your own, you keep your people in the villages and whatnot. And shinobi ninja, they were hired for reconnaissance, for doing the dirty work, but instead of they weren't running around throwing ninja stars and stabbing people through screen doors. Mostly they're arsonists, right? You have a castle you need to get into. What do? You send someone in there and set something on fire. A lot of stuff's made out of wood because of the nature of tectonic plates. So stuff burns. And that was one of the main jobs of ninja shinobi. But yeah, you're right. Like they're a perfect example of this authenticity, this symbolism being used as a shorthand in gaming for something that is much more complex, but is now instantly recognizable. You have a guy in black pajamas running around, you know it's a ninja, even though, right, like you said, they're going to be disguised as peasants or priests or someone who nobles won't even look at twice, because that's the point. You're trying not to be seen.
Yeah,
Also, someone
you're
pointed
gonna
out that
look twice at a guy all in black.
yeah, wearing black at night stands out actually.
Funny how that works out.
Yeah, you want to be in like a dark blue, or something like that, something more surroundings. Black stands out
Covert.
in the dark.
Yeah. By the way, if you're a geologist and want to talk about the tectonic plates under Japan and how it relates to the forts there, head us up. We'll invite you on.
That's another topic for another day, isn't it?
Yeah, because it is interesting, speaking of things that aren't accurate in the game, that almost all of the forts that you see are these big stone things, and you couldn't burn them down if you wanted to. Like the main building is going to be wood, and some of the guardhouses are wood, but
Hmm.
most of the walls and everything is just stone, so you can't burn it down.
No, that's not
And
so
I
bad.
think,
That happened. They have the stone bases to put them on, and then it's a
sure,
keep that's made of wood, and a lot of the inner buildings that are made of wood, and those are the ones that you set on fire.
sure, but I mean, I more mean that every single city is just perched on top of a stone block, and I don't think that that's accurate.
True.
Is it? Did all of them have the stone blocks?
Oh no, not every fort. A
Okay.
lot of the big ones, you did do that, and they had stone walls underneath a wooden wall. Like
Interesting.
Hikone Castle is one of the few in Shigaken that is still standing. The same keep from 1603, I think it is, because most of the castles, were destroyed during the Second World War, but a few of them managed to skip it. Hikone is kind of off in the distance, not on any sort of main road or anything, so it didn't actually get bombed. So the castle there is still intact, and its walls are have the stone base, and it's got the multi tiers going up and up to the very uncomfortable looking keep. In fact, they use it for shooting a lot of films and movies. If you ever watched the 80s Shogun miniseries, a lot of the castle scenes are shot at Hikone Castle. There's your
That's
random
interesting.
trivia for the day.
I feel like we're dispensing a lot of random trivia here.
Yeah, is that bad? I mean, this is supposed to be a casual podcast, yeah?
I do. I think it's casual. We just happen to know a lot of very strange facts.
Yeah.
That's fine.
We're also get to talk about the fact that Hikonejo is in TV and you can go watch it.
That's interesting. Go watch it and then just decide if Shogun 2 is accurate or not.
We could talk about the movie James Clavell's Shogun and what that gets wrong.
Boy.
But no. Okay, back to diplomacy, warfare. We're talking about war games, and this is the war game.
real quick, I do want to mention one final thing about the diplomatic side before we jump into talking about the warfare parts, which is, I think, probably our selling point.
Please.
Is that it is interesting that the game models diplomacy and the shogun's personal honor in addition to how they will weigh a diplomatic request by you. So if you're some guy that they all know as a backstabber, or if you're dishonorable, they're not going to do deals with you as much. And I thought that was interesting because it kind of reminded me of the Western concept of chivalric knights and kings and how they made deals. I have no idea if that's accurate or not, or how much the Japanese thought of honor came into interclan relations. I don't think it would be very much, but I could be wrong. Joe, do you have any more insight on that?
Right. Now begins the 8-hour lecture on Bushido and what the hell that means.
I know that Bushido is kind of a very weird concept, especially because it has become its own animal starting around 1900.
Yeah, that's when it, the 19th and early 20th century version of Bushido is the Bushido we know. And it is what's been retroactively reapplied to the past. What was happening in Shikoku Jidai is much more pragmatic because what you have is real life into the situations. Now they have codes of conduct and honor codes that are supposed to be
Sure.
all encompassing because that's how military elites function the globe over. Same with Western chivalry. But in the moment, you tend to do what you got to do to survive. The idea of death before dishonor, death before all things, loyalty to your lord before all things, that more so is a product of the Edo period when people who are samurai, who are hereditarily inheriting the role and the status of samurai, are applying to themselves and the past to justify their specific better station in life. They're better than everyone else because they're samurai, because they are honorable, good fighters. None of those guys have to prove it because they're sitting in a world that is largely at peace. And where you have the samurai taking on the role of bureaucrats and increasingly losing what makes them special. So you have people training with the sword and whatnot and wearing their swords because it allows them to visibly set themselves apart from the rest of them, the peasants, and even worse, the merchants, right?
Yeah, it is interesting that they make themselves out to seem so hardcore based on fabricated things that they have started saying about their fathers and grandfathers. And my grandfather fought for this country and he decided death before dishonor or whatever. Anyway, I'm in charge of you because of him.
Yeah, and I mean, and that's just part of, like, they're there, right? You have these epic stories of individual duels, which are very rare. You have, you know, important people committing suicide rather than being captured, and that's just part of what the samurai are, and part of this evolving set of ideals. But your honor works in this period as long as it works, right? It's not a be all end all, and the amount of backstabbing, betrayal, side swapping, ambushes, all these things that would seem antithetical to honor happened regularly. People, battles were won, and one side wasn't wiped out when they lost the battle. They fled because they don't want to die. The construction of Bushido and the Japanese honor system that we have now is that 20th century construction that we see in the Second World War, which is an entire separate can of worms and the culmination of a lot of horrifically repressive education systems, state Shinto, ardent nationalism, pseudo-fascism, all of these things that came together to produce that generation of, tragedy, basically. But it's very different when you're looking back in the Sengoku Jidai when these things are actually happening before they're lionized and changed in the Edo period and later, right? Like Hagakure, one of the famous books about samurai honor and what samurai rules are like, though that was written by the great grandson of a fighting samurai who was a monk at the time, basically spouting this stuff off, and it was being recorded by his disciples. And that still is one of the key books. Like, you see like Hagakure for Business on the walls next to Sun Tzu, right? It's yeah, it's part of a culture trying to understand and then disseminate, codify and disseminate what they felt their class was supposed to do in times of war. And the reality is always much messier. Because, I mean, we could talk about how in this period, in this Warring States period, this period of such upheaval and such absolute chaos all up and down the country, that being a samurai wasn't hereditary. You could become a samurai if you fought really well. Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the second great unifier, was a sandal bearer, right? And he had to fabricate some lineage that tied him into the Fujiwara clan or something to try and legitimize his rise to power, because he wasn't anybody. But he performed well, he got into Oda Nobunaga's good graces, and there you go, he rose to the ranks. Went from carrying shoes to invading Korea in a disastrous attempt 30 years later, right?
Yeah, great job, Hideyoshi.
Yeah, he was losing his mind then. But that's okay.
That seems to happen a lot.
Yeah.
I think we have probably diverted enough. People want to hear about the warfare of Shogun 2.
Right. It's wrong.
Yeah. All right, end of podcast. Thanks for coming, everyone. Good show.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. But yeah, we should getting into that, right? Like, Shogun Total War is a game. Shogun or Total War as a game has set rules and whatnot that it has built into its game that are part of how the game is played, right? You were talking to me earlier about this. There's a rock, paper, scissors mechanic.
Right.
I went digging into some of the early stuff they did for Shogun 1, and when they were trying to construct the AI for that, they were actually trying to look at Sun Tzu, of all things, to try and create
famous Japanese general Sun Tzu.
Well, actually, I mean, okay. Another minor diversion. Japanese military strategy and thought and tactics are largely derived from classical Chinese sources. That's just the way it went, right? It changed and evolving based on the specific situation in the Chinese islands. Sorry, the Japanese home islands. So, like,
I didn't know you were a Chinese nationalist, Joe.
Oh yes, suddenly. There you go. Whip off the mask.
After last episode, after all we've been through.
Yes, this whole time I'm a secret. What would this even be? Like, China re-own Japan? Never mind. The point is that a lot of the classic study of military strategy and tactics came from Tang China, right? Like a Chinese dynasty. With Buddhism comes a lot of cultural what haves you, including the study of warfare. And that was part of it in the early days. But as you get into periods of, longer peace in Japan, you have a shifting away from the idea of standing state armies into this more mercenary for hire vibe of early samurai, which then is changed with contact between the Japanese and Japan's original native inhabitants. The Ainu are example, and there's other tribes that were there who were horse archers, and they learned from that. So it's a very interesting mesh of how Japanese warfare develops. Right, you have this classical influence from China meeting the specific needs of regional leadership with access to small bands of loyal fighters dealing with restless natives in the countryside, right? And that's where we get a different development streak here.
And that's what the good people at CA were looking at for Shogun 1. They were studying Sun Tzu.
Yeah, when they were coding the AI for... This is from the YouTube channel AI and Games. It's a great channel talking about how game development deals with AI for specific topics, and he did one on Total War, so I thought I'd watch that, and he was talking about how they were trying to make it less gamey by working in different stratagems, like, okay, Sun Tzu says if you outnumber them 10-1, surround your forces. If you outnumber them 5-1, you should attack. 3-1, you should hold back. And they tried to implement that into how the enemy AI will actually use its troops. And they've tried to keep with that as they went through the different games. So it's interesting to me that they tried to do that extra bit when coding the AI to deal with these kinds of things. So it's fascinating. In reality, it doesn't quite work out because it's, it's not... Anyone who's played Total War know the enemy AI doesn't really act entirely consistently or elegantly when you're fighting, because it's just, there's a lot of systems going on, and it's very difficult. It's not going to be perfect when you're playing it.
No, I mean, you can't code Sun Tzu into a game. Like, you can't just play against Sun Tzu. The AI will not appear. The AI will not understand when far away appear near. They won't get that.
Mm-hmm. But I suppose the point is that the structure of the game that we're playing is more rooted in the fact that it's a game that is trying to be playable within a set of its own rules, rather than trying to be an entirely accurate reflection of the nature of the warfare it's trying to emulate. That's what I was trying to get.
All right, there we go.
Mm-hmm. I knew I'd get there eventually, right? I just tripped up along the way.
So,
go on.
Oh, sorry. So, Shogun 2. What we want to talk about most of all, out of anything about it, is the battles. So, they weren't able to emulate Sun Tzu, clearly, for Shogun 2. And it's just kind of the structure of the battles is the very strange and interesting thing. Because, as we mentioned earlier, at probably no point in Japanese history did they line up in tidy little formations with 160 guys all with katanas standing there in a line, and then they would go running at the other guys with katanas in a line.
Yeah, that's an egregious one. I don't know why they added katana units for Shogun 2, because Shogun 1 didn't have that, and most other games don't do that, because that's, the saber is a sidearm, and no one fighting on a battlefield wants to get close enough that you have to use your sidearm, right? You have spears, yari, you have long poking weapons, which are easier to train people in, and then you have bows and your muskets.
Yeah, and what's interesting about that is that, as Joe briefly mentioned earlier, that plays into the rock, paper, scissors formula of what appears to be all war games now. They will all have a unit class beats other unit class beats the first unit class formula. So in the case of Total War Games, what it seems to be is cavalry beats swords beats spears beats horses. So and that has some modifications to it. But generally, that's what it is. So what I think they were doing for Shogun 2 is you have your Yari samurai, your Naginata samurai, who were good at killing off enemy cavalry units or defending against them. But when you wanted to charge into enemy infantry and kill them, you wanted to send in your sword units because the sword units are better at killing infantry than spear units for reasons that are beyond my comprehension.
Yeah, like I think it's illustrative to talk about what some standard tactics were for Sengoku Jidai land battles for like infantry. So you're right. In the game, we have units who are wholly made up of a single weapon type for ease of play. But if we're talking about like a spear versus spear situation, from what we can glean, the idea was mostly for non-samurai soldiers, right? They're called Ashigaru, Lightfoot. They're
They're
conscripted
kind of like the
soldiers.
militia units in the game.
Yeah, they were higher than that socially. Like when you were conscripted or hired on to be a foot soldier, you weren't in the same class as like, all right, grab Bob from down the street, give him a spear, off you go. They were trained and drilled because most commanders knew that you needed, efficient manpower to make these things work. But again, the spear is a relatively easy weapon to handle. But so you'd have the Ashigaru, but there'd be samurai mixed in there because the samurai are elite, training forever types, and they'd be part of the same formations. So one of the standard tactics is you have the two Ashigaru units, and if you're trying to attack another one, you'd be poking and pushing down with your spears. So you're whacking down in an up down motion to try and knock spears out of the way, getting as close as you can to then unleash the samurai within your own unit to go in for close fighting and scarier fighting. They're better.
And these samurai were also equipped with spears and whatnot most of the time.
Yeah. You wouldn't. Again, if you're fighting a bunch of people with spears, you want to be fighting with a spear as well, because
Right.
the Lord of the Rings film Ian kind of thing where Aragorn and some elves with swords charge into Uruk-hai with spears and knock them all away handily before carving people up. That only works if they don't move, right?
Well, I mean, the orcs weren't very trained, I guess.
Yeah,
I don't know.
But,
I don't know Saruman's training routine.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure it was not as efficient as it could have been. That's for another day.
Yeah. we could. I don't want to get off topic because I will talk about Lord of the Rings for another 3 hours. I don't want to do that right now.
Let's do a Lord of the Rings episode. Okay, anyways.
We will 100% do a Lord of the Rings episode, but we're talking about Shogun 2 right now.
Mm-hmm. So, but the point is that kind of intricacies when you're dealing with the game with a 3D engine with every single little man, rendered, that's just not going to happen, right? You're not going to have a game where that's how the spear units interact with each other, with this kind of push, knocking away, trying to open gaps to be exploited by small groups of more heavily armored units wholly within that. And then at a larger level, even you're going to have groups are organized by their social hierarchical allegiances, right? So you're going to have people with bows and spears and everything who are working in close proximity to one another. They'll be individually commanded by their platoon leader equivalent, right? But they're going to be working in concert, like pike and shot type formations. Not as close as that, but that kind of idea that these things are interlocked. It's one of the reasons why ground archery in the Sengoku Jidai doesn't have to worry as much about the traditional samurai mounted archer, worry, is because they have close by almost integrated spearman units running around.
You know what's interesting about that is that it kind of sounds a lot like early Greco-Persian combat with each other, where they would get into these formations of just guys with spears and shields and go just jab at each other, and then have individual champions maybe jump out and challenge each other to combat one-on-one, because that was a thing that did happen in the early periods where you had hoplites and phalanxes and whatnot. That is something that you did see in that period, and it is funny how a world away, 1,500 years later, you see more or less the same thing happening in Japan. the same kind of, spear units trying to loosen up the other unit enough to send in their elite soldiers to go kill a bunch of the peasants until they run off.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know anything at all about or Greco-Roman or earlier warfare, so that's really interesting that was something that you think that happened, because I
That
find
was
that
earlier
fascinating.
Greek warfare. That was before really that was before the Romans showed up.
Mm.
This that kind of thing that happened. It was boy, I don't remember the source off the top of my head, but that's what current historians think combat looks like. Obviously, we can't know for certain.
Yeah,
but that's one of the things that's one of the hypotheses they have for the period is isolating people and sending in your champions to go fight their champions, or sending in your champion to go mess up their whole formation.
interesting. Because yeah, like you hit on a very important point here, is that we're talking about, I'm talking definitively, like, this is how tactics happened in Sengoku Jidai, but of course this is, at best reconstructions from scattered reporting and then literary sources, which are always fraught with danger. So this is the best guess we have, and that's led to some interesting changes recently, right? Because you mentioned dueling in this pre-Roman Western Asian kind of fighting, and that's something that has changed relatively recently in the understanding of how samurai warfare worked. Because I started my undergrad and hell, even my master's, believing that individual samurai duels on the battlefield were a thing, because that was what I was taught, and that's what some of the sources I was reading indicated. But now they're thinking that that's not really the case, because of the nature of samurai warfare even at this period. So like the idea before was that samurai would announce themselves, their lineage, and then pair off with worthy fighters to, earn themselves honor by defeating someone who mattered, right? And that was in a lot of, even scholarly works about this. But the more we look at the realities of military conflict in the period, the more that kind of falls apart. Even mostly we have those coming from literary sources, but even then it's not universal. A lot of literary sources actually show people who tried to duel but then were interrupted and murdered by like a common soldier or something. Because I think the greatest indicator as to why this wouldn't be a real thing to me comes from the phrase, all right, if you're announcing that you're too good to fight me, then that means you are a very good target for me to fight, right? Because if I'm a lowly nobody and you say you're too good for me, and if I kill you, that means I'm better than you. So the idea of samurai pairing off and dueling just falls apart at the when you actually start scrutinizing it. And this is just a part of the difficulty of using the few sources we have to try and understand these kinds of, pre-modern warfare. We don't have really accurate measures. But Shogun 2, unlike, say, Total War Troy and Three Kingdoms, doesn't have a proper... Yeah, it doesn't have a proper duel mechanic in it. I feel, though, if they were to make it today, they would have included it.
It has become something of a cool feature. I think it makes more sense for the Three Kingdoms period, where you're supposed to have these, wushu, amazing fighters fighting each other. To an extent, was accurate, because you have people like Lubu and Guan Yu, who were apparently really amazing fighters and fought people one-on-one. That did happen, apparently. I can't say for certain, I wasn't there, but according to sources, that is something that did happen, is that they would fight people one-on-one. But for this period, I can't speak for the veracity of how frequently that happened, and I don't know if anyone can.
Yep.
Again, if you're listening and you have a time machine, let us know and we'll invite you on the podcast.
Yeah, last reading of that, and I'm not a China scholar, especially not an ancient China scholar, but my last brief interaction with that was that there was like 2 or 3 duels in the 100-year period, and that's why they were so impactful or amazing, because they stood out as like, wow, these guys actually dueled, and it was this amazing clash of titans thing. But part of the Three Kingdoms issue is that it's they're being much more fanciful with how they're approaching the game, and I have no problem with
Right.
that. Like they're embracing the romance of Three Kingdoms, the classic text, the story, the narrative. Whereas these games, like Total War, Shogun, they're not making those kinds of claims. So I have less of
Right.
an issue with, say, Troy or Three Kingdoms being wacky because they're saying we are taking the literary push here. It's like the movie 300, right? It's an egregious ball of horrendous mistakes, but it's supposed to be this wacky, over the top literary look at, this battle from the very specific point of view of this Spartan warrior hyping up other Spartan warriors about how amazing the Spartan warriors are. So like it fits that kind of horrifically propagandistic, ridiculous view of the conflict because that's what they were going for. So I'm less inclined to humph and stomp my feet and be mad at it. Same with the more fluffy Total Wars. And like I'm not mad at Shogun 2, of course, but it's easier to pick apart and talk about how these differences are being presented to us when the veneer of historical accuracy and authenticity is there.
Right. Well, it's not. I don't want to. This is going to sound harsh. It's not pretending to be. So, Three Kingdoms and Troy and the Warhammer games aren't pretending to be historically accurate. They know that they're not. They're drawing from history, but they aren't going to be historically accurate, and they're not portraying themselves as such. And that's a whole nother story. I don't want to sound like I'm, crapping on Shogun 2 here or anything, but I think that the difference is that something like Shogun 2 has a lot of these things that are authentic but inaccurate, but it doesn't show the fact like, oh, hey, we're leaning into the fact that we're going for authenticity instead of accuracy. And so someone who picks up a Total War game and plays this is going to take a lot of this as fact because, for a lot of Westerners like ourselves, what other sources do we have for the Sengoku Jidai period? I can tell you that if this was my first Total War game, I'm like, I don't know, 12, 13. I pick up a Total War game, I see this, I'm like, wow, that's Japan. And that will just be my perception of it.
And that's the danger, but the importance of to toot our own horn, a podcast like this where we're talking about games and history and warfare and how it's presented, because like I said earlier, a lot of people are getting their history this way. So if you're not making that over the top claim like they are with Troy and Three Kingdoms, that like we're leaning into the fanciful, then there's a bit more of a burden on the developers to at least own the representation they're giving us, right? Like we can talk about that with Ghost of Tsushima, because that is a game that is set during the Mongol invasion in the 1270s, but with an aesthetic and a vibe that is entirely Chambara movies of Edo period samurai.
Oh, yes.
And but they lean into that, and they say that. They say, we're making a Chambara film, we're making a Kurosawa film. There's a Kurosawa grain filter we can put over it. This is not an accurate representation of the island of Tsushima at all.
Yeah.
Or the invasion.
We could talk about Ghost of Tsushima for a long time. I think we're both very big fans of that game. I do think it is interesting that the game kind of was both at the same time more authentic and accurate, but also less accurate than Shogun 2, because it did decide to get more into the nitty gritty of things and lean into it and show what period life was like for people. But then at the same time, there's a duel near the beginning of the game where you fight a guy who apparently possesses the power of lightning or whatever, and he's got this unblockable strike, and you're fighting him during a thunderstorm, and then you beat him, and then the lightning hits him and he explodes, and it's so awesome, and it's like, yes.
Yeah.
So that's not accurate, but it's awesome.
Yeah, that's like overtly not accurate, right? The more insidious, to use to be sinister about it, inaccuracies that bothered me was stuff like Tsushima has always been a meeting place for Japan and Korea. There is not a single Korean person in that game. And I'm like right at the end. I'm at the final couple missions here, and I still haven't seen a Korean. And there are a lot of people who have Korean descent on that island at that time. That was a major trade post between the two countries and a major cultural space for integration. And it's just not there, because Ghost of Tsushima is about Japan, the mainland, as perceived by a 20th century filmmaker who grew up during the war period, who had things to say about fascism projecting it into 1700s Japan samurai and fighting, which is then dressed like 1500s Japanese samurai and fighting, but set in the 1200s Mongol invasion.
Yeah, there's like I don't know. There's like 8 layers of things that you need to get through of learning about historicity. I don't know, the historicality of things in order to get to there. There's just so many influences on Ghost of Tsushima that through all of the content in it, there are accurate things, but it's painted by so many other things. It's been influenced by a thing that's been influenced by something else, and so on and so forth. There's so many things we could talk about there, and I think the Ghost of Tsushima might unfortunately be out of the scope of this podcast, but I would love to talk about that with anyone at any time. Love that game. It's probably one of my favorites of the last 10 years.
Yeah, I'm really enjoying it too. Good. But I feel like it at least the mention of it fits in because it means that this talk we're having is still bears relevance in 2020, right? Shogun 2 is an older game, but there are other games that are still dealing with this framework of what is medieval Japan, being painted on whatever they're doing.
I would bet $100 that people who made Ghost of Tsushima, at least some of them played Shogun 2, and some of that influenced the work that they put into Ghost of Tsushima.
Oh, I'm sure.
Because there's no way it didn't. It's the same way that the Kurosawa films influenced Shogun 2. There's no way that Shogun 2 didn't also influence Ghost of Tsushima. Not that the people who made Ghost of Tsushima didn't watch Kurosawa films, but there's no way that like the influence didn't have any impact on them.
Yeah, I hope those films are running, like the entire catalog of his Chambara stuff is running on a loop in the background of the studio when they're working on it.
Yeah, I think they're really leaning into like the more fanciful aspects too, because they're coming out with a new mode this fall about where you're just a bunch of it's a co-op thing, but you're running in around in this mystical fantastical world where you're fighting Oni and stuff now. So they're really leaning into the more not realistic aspects of it, which is fun, but not accurate. If you are someone who can verify that Oni do exist, we'll invite you on the podcast, but unless you have proof, sorry, you're not allowed in.
There was a watch out for Kappa crossing near my apartment in Hikone back in the day.
That's pretty great.
Yeah.
I love that. That's good.
Mm-hmm.
So one last thing that I think that we should address before we move on to the DLCs here is that you took major umbrage with this, Joe, and I'll let you talk about this for a few minutes, but the impact of arrows and the range of arrows in Shogun 2, where if you don't know how ranged weapons work in the Total War games, basically you set your guys up, your 160-ish guys in a line and move them just close enough you can see an outline on the ground of what the range of the max range of their weapon is. And so if you move them just close enough, they'll start firing, and I'll let Joe explain from here.
Yeah, I felt so validated because I had a problem with this for a long time because it's arrows work on the force that they have leaving the bow, right? So the less distance an arrow has to travel when it is released from a bow, the more force will still be behind it. Therefore, the more damage, air quotes, it'll do to a target it hits. So the closer you are with a bow, you will inflict more, penetrate more than the further you are away from your target. Total War and a lot of games don't take that into account, and again, that's a gameplay issue, I understand that, but it's especially egregious to me when you're playing a game like this, where a lot of the arrow warfare, especially in actually this leads into the DLC, especially in the Rise of the Samurai DLC, the way fighting occurred, it had to be close range. You had to have samurai mounted close to each other, picking targets and firing at close range to get around or get through the armor that they had, because they had pretty effective anti-arrow armor for the time. Now, because of how Total War works, and arrows do a set number of damage regardless of distance as long as they hit, the game never comes close to reflecting that, and is very visually abrupt when you're looking at it from a mounted samurai point of view. And I'm so happy to see a while ago, Dr. Brett Devereaux, who has a blog called, what is it called here? A collection of unmitigated pedantry, which again I think describes a lot of what we do when we talk about games. Had a whole article looking at the math of Total War, because he says he teaches medieval military history, and he says more and more students giving him papers are actually like drawing from Total War in terms of understanding tactics. So they're talking about maximum ranges of weapons. They're talking about speed of units on the ground to maneuver in and out of range and all that in academic papers in class, because that's their point of understanding, right? That's the point of interaction with this topic before being in a class specifically dedicated to medieval military history, is playing these games. So it's influencing how they're thinking about it, and that makes it important. So here we have a especially egregious example of it, because when playing the Rise of Samurai DLC, I found the most effective way of dealing with anything was to create long lines of archers, even the mounted samurai archers, and duel at extreme ranges, intervening terrain aside, and just make sure you could concentrate more fire on a certain place than others. So the game turned into this like artillery duel of archers firing at each other from across the map, instead of anything reflecting what we know early samurai warfare to look like. And if I didn't know what early samurai warfare looked like, and I was more impressionable playing this kind of game, it makes sense on the surface, right? Arrows hurt. You want to have long range arrows so you can do damage further away. It makes sense with more modern understandings of artillery and weapons systems and all that, right? That we know if you have range on your enemy, that's good. But it doesn't quite work that way when you personally are creating the force required for using your weapon system. So that bothered me, but it also that ties into this overarching idea that games are influencing the way people understand the history that they aren't engaging with on a regular basis.
Right. And there's a lot to take away from that. I think that, well, it's a repeated topic of what we've been talking about this whole time. It's just that if this is your only source of media, if this is the only source of media on the period, that will be what you take away from it, unless you're told otherwise. And there's not a lot of very popular, historically accurate things on Japan in the period. Um, I can't think of many movies that portray the rise of the samurai period, which is, I don't know, I think the game takes place around 1000. The expansion does.
Yeah, it's the
Right?
1060s when the Genpei War, because it's specifically the Genpei War when you see the creation of the first shogunate. But of course, I'm a historian, so I can't remember dates to save my life. 1180 to 1185. Look at me, off by a century. That's terrible.
The Total War games do kind of fudge the edges of them a bit, because I think that for the main campaign of the game, the dates aren't accurate either. It's just kind of a window in time which things could have happened, and therefore you do that then.
Yeah,
I think that's why they do that for the Rise of the Samurai DLC as well.
makes sense. Like the Sengoku Jidai period is the 1450s, with the small war that broke out in the Kyoto region and extends all the way to 1603, if you want to talk about the establishment of the new shogunate, or even further if you talk about the assault on Osaka Castle happened in like the 1615. I'm gonna get pilloried. I'm not good at dates. I always write everything down.
I'm going to start adding all of the people who I know that know Japanese history and tell them to come after you.
Oh no.
I'm gonna get them.
Gonna lose my scholarships and everything. Oh no.
Yeah, so the Rise of the Samurai DLC is painted, I guess, in terms of authenticity. How authentic would you say it is? I didn't play this DLC. I just never ended up picking it up, so I don't know as much about it as you do.
I feel like it has it's trying, and I appreciate that, because it's a very well, it sounds so condescending and awful, doesn't it? But like they're restricting you to picking one of 3 clans with 2 like cadet branches based on gameplay whatnots. So if you pick one Minamoto clan, you get like better archers. If you pick another one, you get cheaper recruitment or something like that. But the war was between the Minamoto and the Taira clans for control over, basically for control over the emperor, and who would be appointing new emperors and who would be getting their family involved. And it's a long and messy story where the Taira were ahead of the game because they had managed to beat down the Minamoto, and then the Minamoto came back up, and there was this actual period of warfare. And this is also a very important part of classical Japanese history because you get the Heiki Monogatari, this Iliad-ish epic of Japanese heroes and battles and intrigue and betrayals and all that. It's a very important foundational text. It's also full of a lot of this very fluffy, floaty literary stuff, right? This is where you get a lot of those introductions and a lot of these famous duels and famous betrayals and whatnot. So it's an important part of the history. It's also an important part of the literary development of, Japanese understandings of warrior culture and all that. So it's important DLC because it tries to bring that into a game. And I don't know if I know any game off the top of my head that deals with the Genpei War as a topic outside of this one. Maybe Sengoku has something for it, but I don't know. The point is that the game tries to take that, but also tries to extend it into this full map of Japan game of Total War, where you're trying to conquer territories, trying to make alliances. They have different systems where you're sending, I forget the name of them, individuals to different provinces to try and win over, like improve their their idea of your clan, and then you can like buy them to make them join you. And they also throw in the Fujiwara clan, and that's interesting to me because it's like a three-way war in the game. It's a two-way war in real life. Minamoto versus the Taira, the Genji and the Heiki, right? But in the game, they throw in the Fujiwara, who were once the most important clan in Japan, and they had a lot of the political power during the Heian period, which was a period of like pretty much a long peace, but also the seat of a lot of cultural development. That's where we get the tale of Genji from Murasaki Shikibu. A lot of classic literature comes out of the Heian period, and the Fujiwara clan was important there. So they're trying to like bring them back in as this third shadowy force that's good with politics and good with diplomacy, but not as good fighters, to try and weasel their way in. So it's an interesting DLC, but very like I said, I had a real problem with the way the warfare was portrayed because it's still the same game. So a lot of the stuff they tried to do for the Sengoku period, having large groups of infantry, Ashigaru backed up by samurai, they're kind of doing that again, but scaling it down. And they have more Naginata, which is important because there were more Naginata. They have more archers, which is important because archery was still the big defining thing. But it just doesn't scale the way I feel it should, and it kind of put me off the entire time I was trying to play it.
Well, speaking of things that put you off, let's talk about the last big expansion for the Shogun 2 Total War game to finish us out here tonight. That is Shogun 2 Fall of the Samurai. Now, this one takes place
as opposed to either the 1500s and 1600s or the late
1100s.
Yeah. It takes place in the late 1800s. Actually, the campaign starts in 1863. And this one, you play as one of the fighters in the Boshin War, which is another civil war in Japan. Maybe I should let you describe this more because I feel like I'm going to fudge it if I try to describe what the war was about. You'd probably be a better person to speak on that.
Okay, briefly, the Boshin War was the civil war that came about because of Western intervention in Japan in the 1850s, where suddenly the Western world came knocking on Japan's door and said, you have to open up to trade with the rest of us. And that, of course, led to a lot of, or contributed significantly to a lot of underlying tensions already happening in, late Edo Japan. So Japan at that point was under control of the shogun, the same Tokugawa shogun family that won the Sengoku Jidai, that won the Civil War period. But their control was starting to slip up and down the country because of stuff like samurai wages weren't being keep up with inflation. There was recessions. There was a lot of a famine popping out. Like, it was a rough time, and then to be hit by this, this assault on the order of things really, threw more oil on the fire. So what we had was a shogun who. So what is Shogun? Shogun is a great barbarian subduing general. That's the title. That's their job. And what are they not doing when the Westerners show up and enforce treaty demands? They are not subduing barbarians. So a lot of more patriotically minded Japanese who happen to also be disenfranchised samurai from the Tozama domains, the domains on the periphery who Tokugawa Ieyasu way back in the 1600s decided weren't loyal and therefore were given the worst fiefs, worst prefectures to govern over. A lot of them saw this as a way to reestablish themselves. So the Choshu domain and Satsuma domain, those two were places that were sidelined for the last couple hundred years of Japanese history, while in Tokyo, in Edo, the shogun ruled over, right? So you have these groups, and the young samurai of those groups seeing the shogun weakening, seeing the shogun not doing his job, and seeing a chance to reassert themselves and rid themselves of these barbarians, the Westerners. So they rise up in a series of civil wars, a series of insurrections, basically, that the Edo government has to try and put down. And that general kerfuffle is the Boshin War. And it's not insignificant. It's not small. It's not bloodless. It was a pretty horrendous conflict for the brief time it was actually happening, especially for the regions that were loyal to the shogun and fought against the rebels there.
Right. Mm-hmm. And the point of entry for a lot of people into this conflict would probably be in famous Tom Cruise movie The Last Samurai, shows Tom Cruise as a U.S. advisor coming to Japan to show the shogunate forces how to beat the imperial forces, and then he gets captured by the imperial forces and ends up working with them.
It's such a weird film for me.
It is very
because
strange.
It's fun. I like it, but it's doing two things there, right? It's doing the Saigo Takamori's rebellion, the Satsuma rebellion that happened in the 1870s, because that's who the main Last Samurai character is, right? He's a facsimile of Saigo Takamori, the actual, air quotes, Last Samurai, and his rebellion. But also it's happening simultaneously with the initial creation of an imperial army. Like the timeline is confused because the movie is about the Satsuma rebellion, but by then they already had a trained imperial army because they were forged in the fires of the Boshin War. So the movie's got a very slippery timeline itself. But yes, that is the biggest, Western cultural touchstone for this period of history, this rapid transformation, right? Militarily, is Tom Cruise going all Dances with Wolves about the samurai. And I have a lot of problems actually with how that movie does samurai, because they treat them like a separate species, and that is just so weird to me. Like they're walking through the street and everyone's like, oh, samurai, and they're like hiding and stuff, and then they go to the mountains where the samurai are living their samurai lives. They're just like everyone else, right? They're Japanese people too. They're just high class. They're aristocrats. They're a social class separate from the other social classes, but they don't live in like isolated mountain communes or whatever. It was a strange thing to me that they tried to separate the samurai from the Japanese in a very Dances with Wolves way, right? Like here's the people, and then here's the natives who are better, right? And that's the gist of the movie, and that's weird to me because it's not reflective of what was going on at all.
And it definitely did influence Fall of the Samurai, because in this DLC you can play as one of the factions in either the Imperial or Shogunate side, or decide to forge your own path and form the Republic of Japan, which is very hard to do. But in this, what's weird and very ahistorical, and I wanted to mention this because it was recently pointed out in another podcast I listened to Dr. Nairi Bakalian mentioned this, and I feel the need that I also need to say this since we're talking about it, that it shows there's a dichotomy of either you pick tradition and you have high morale units that have, just like katanas or whatever, or you pick technology and you get the lower morale units, but they all have, repeating rifles and whatnot. And that's a very unrealistic thing. Is the idea of like, oh, we don't want to use modern weapons because we're better than them because we have our high morale bonsai, whatever, like the kind of thing that they would say in the game.
Mm-hmm.
But the reality of the situation is that Japan at the period had issues importing a lot of these weapons, especially if they're one of the not approved government clans to get these weapons. If the government doesn't like them, they're definitely not going to be able to easily import weapons to these provinces to rebel against the government with. They're not going to get, these early Gatling guns, these repeating rifles to go fight the government with, because why would the government let them get those weapons? It doesn't make any sense. So the game is like, oh yeah, they chose to not use modern weapons, and that's just kind of a false choice there. 100%, if they could get their hands on a modern repeating rifle at the time, they would have done that. There's no reason to not do that.
Yeah, both sides were trying incredibly hard to get as many modern weapons as they could, and there was a lot of backhand deals in Satsuma and the tiny bits of the Choshu and all that to try and get as many guns as they possibly could from any vendor who would sell it to them, right? Like it's a big deal because, again, pragmatically, it's how you win wars, right? It's not about defending this weird fictitious version of honor. It's about winning.
I mean, to cite another example of some of the idea of this happening, something that you're very familiar with, Joe, is the Boxer Rebellion, which happened in China about 30 years after this DLC is supposed to take place, where a lot of the local Chinese didn't like the Western influence there, and they tried to kick the Westerners out. And the first time that they approached the Western forces, they believed that they didn't need weapons, like modern weapons, to go fight them off. And they were slaughtered. And then immediately after that, they started using various tactics to counter the fact that they didn't have the same kind of weaponry that the Westerners had. So it's not like, like, oh, these people are like stupid or backwards or whatever. They just didn't have access to the same kinds of things that like the government forces had. That's just how a lot of this stuff goes, is that these people aren't going to turn down the better weapons. They just don't have access to them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the Boxers are an interesting case because it's a a peasant, like it's not an organized single force. So yeah, you do have those stories of the first groups trying to do their martial arts and do the things that they practice, their pseudo-religious, what's the word? Like you do your prayers and your dances, and then you're going to be good to go, and then that not working, and then trying to actually act as a guerrilla force. The ones that were working with the Chinese army, when the Chinese army would give them weapons, oh boy, they use weapons, right? But it's not something that happened a lot because it's a very back and forth issue. And here, you have stories in the Boshin War, anecdotal stories that come out of it of samurai who don't really understand how to fight because they're still doing the practicing with your sword kind of thing that's been going on for the entire Edo period, and then now they're forced to fight an actual battle. So there's a couple of anecdotes that I love from my master's reading there. They like the groups would meet, shoot once, and then drop the guns and then run into each other and try and sword fight because that's what you're supposed to do, right? But on a great,
because they're bureaucrats, they don't understand how fighting works. They've all been bureaucrats for hundreds of years at this point.
Yeah, and they have as martial training is this ritualized training of dueling that they've been doing for hundreds of years without real conflict, right? So like that's part of it. But yeah, like when it comes to actual fighting of war here, acquiring weapons, and it goes to show, like, as soon as you have these big battles in the Boshin War, both sides commanders can see how important having modern weapons is, and then they make note of that and they try and influence it so the next battles they fight, they can bring more modern weapons to bear. So it's a very important part of how this war went down. The issue with Last Samurai, which I believe I will put money on, is a direct influence for Fall of the Samurai.
There's no way it's not. Yeah. There's absolutely no way it's not.
The Satsuma Rebellion, Saigo Takamori's rebellion that the movie's focusing on generally, which again happened in the 70s, which was way after this war, And the whole point of this movie is that they're too good for guns, right? They're using their traditional samurai ways, and that's what they're going to do. And then the Imperial Army defeats them, spoiler, with their superior
Oops.
guns. And
Sorry for spoiling a 15-year-old
yeah,
movie.
That scene at the end of the movie when Sago Takamori and his samurai charge down the hill and they get eviscerated by Gatling guns and all that, right? That kind of sort of happened at the end of the Summer Rebellion. But it wasn't like that. It was at the end of a multi-day siege where they literally ran out of ammunition. So they're saying, okay, we're out of ammunition. We've lost. Let's go, commit suicide by Imperial Army artillery. And then they charged. It wasn't this appeal to tradition or something. It was, we're out of ammunition. We're going to lose. Let's go out with a bang. And they did, right? And then
It's pretty hardcore regardless.
Oh, it's definitely hardcore, and it's definitely that was part of Sago Takamori's whole deal, was that he was this kind of soldier and that this stuff mattered to him. But had they had more ammunition and weapons, they would have kept fighting, right? It wasn't a charge to close to win. It was an elaborate suicide, and that is badass. But that changes how the movie and then the game deal with traditional weapons versus modern weapons, and both of them are going to influence how people still see the samurai, right? Because this is how the soul of the samurai is the swords, and this stuff would make it easy to believe that they're gonna do this. And this again goes to the Second World War, where every movie ever dealing with the Second World War in the Pacific, you're going to see a banzai charge with someone wielding a flimsy, cast iron katana, because that's what they had at the time, right? And that's just part of how we visualize the samurai culture and the samurai thing in any media. So, yeah, go on.
I was just going to say that, this could be a ripe topic for us to talk about in the future, discussing how movies portraying certain areas have had really big impacts on all media following them, specifically with war games. I mean, we could point out how Saving Private Ryan and Enemy at the Gates, those two movies basically shaped every single World War II game or movie that came out after them.
Oh, definitely.
Specifically. Oh yeah, 100%. I mean, you play like the first Medal of Honor game, the first Call of Duty game. There's just missions just ripped straight from those two movies.
Yeah, I mean, Medal of Honor had Steven Spielberg working on it too, right? So like,
I think he was involved to an extent. I don't know how much he was.
You see the influence. It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, but that's the case with this too. Like Fall of the Samurai, they watched the Last Samurai and they were like, wow, that's it, baby, let's do that. And so you can see it in the game also, that they'll have you can do ahistorical things that are reminiscent of things that you could kind of see in the movie. In the period, they did have Western advisors show up and see what was going on in the period, because this was immediately like post Civil War for the US, and some Western powers who also had trade reasons for wanting to have Japan open were interested to see what would happen. And so they're trying to, feed the side that was going to let them continue to trade with Japan. But in the game, you can just straight up recruit French, British, and US Marines to fight for you. And these units are badass. They're awesome. They will mow down anything in front of them, but it is completely ahistorical, much like the Portuguese terços, I think is what they're called. I actually looked it up earlier after we were talking about the Portuguese terços. There weren't any U.S. Marines in Japan. They didn't come and mow down a bunch of samurai. That's crazy.
The fact that they're better than everyone else too, kind of like, that's kind of Orientalist in a way, isn't it? Get into this.
Yeah, I mean, I could kind of understand it at first, because like the Western armies were trained with this equipment, and then if they show up with it and give it to the Japanese wouldn't know what to do with it right away. So I can kind of understand it, but after they get trained with it, they should be equivalent. I mean, there's nothing magical about a U.S., British, or French Marine that makes them inherently better than a Japanese equivalent that is equivalently trained, other than unless you're racist. But
yeah, actually, that brings up, you bring up two good points there. In the 16th century, when the Westerners were bringing guns to Japan, they didn't tell them how to use them, right? They just sold them, and that was the point, right? You always sold inferior if you're a European empire and you're running around selling guns, you sell last generation guns and you don't tell them how to use them. That's for them
I
to
mean,
figure
they
out.
still do that today. Like the U.S. will sell last generation fighters to people.
Yeah.
They'll sell worse versions of all of the major arms dealers. Always do this. They'll sell the slightly worse versions of what they have.
So it makes sense. But 16th century Japanese armies very quickly figured out how to use these guns very effectively, and you start seeing like firing lines develop really quickly
Yeah.
because they're innovating, and they actually innovated on the guns that the Portuguese brought, and probably made more effective guns for the time, which is really really something. But the 19th century,
As I mentioned, as I mentioned, big fan of Oda Nobunaga. They started creating their own formations that made use of firearms specifically, which is something the Portuguese didn't come over and tell them, okay, well, you want to do this. Like they just made this stuff up on their own.
Yes.
I mean, I think we're kind of defending the Japanese a lot here, but I think it needs to be said. Like they got these weapons, and then they formulated their own tactics with them. It's not like, oh, they were behind the Europeans or anything. They've always been, very smart and everything on their own without this equipment, and it's just they get it, and then they formulate new ideas with it.
Yeah, the fun stats when they're invading Korea, right? They went with more guns than every other weapon system combined because
Interesting.
that's was effective. But yeah, and then you look at the 19th century, right? And immediately they know, the shogun knows, the shogunate government knows, and the rebels who will become the imperial government know that you need to, like, they can see, they know what's going on. They see what happens in China. They're watching the Arrow War. They're watching the Opium War before that. They're seeing these empires run around. They know they have to modernize their military. So what do? They hire people to teach them. So first they're hiring the French because the French are the best ground force in the world, right? Or so they're thinking. And then
At the time,
what happens
maybe,
in
arguably.
what happens in 1871? The French lose decisively to the Germans. So they hire Germans. Like they're smart about it. Then they hired the British to teach them modern naval warfare. So it's I'm wondering why you don't see Germans in Fall of the Samurai as a game, because they were the ones who were actually doing a lot of the administrative construction of the empire, or the imperial army in the 70s was it's all German based, right? All Prussian.
They probably didn't know whether to call them German or Prussian, so just decided to not include them at all.
Yeah, I mean, but that gets to the earlier point about how you have these forces that don't know how to use guns, and like, yeah, there's some anecdotes when they first start fighting that they're not quite sure how to do it, but while that's happening, while people are stumbling about with rifles because the fighting just kind of erupted, both sides are drilling their soldiers with modern weapons in modern tactics with the use of modern advisors. So the things develop very quickly. But another point, I forget what made me think about this. Oh yeah, the fact that they're using the movie as a lot of basis for visual, and for what's going on, is that even now there are not many academic or popular sources that deal with the Boshin War as a topic. I think I've read them all. Like there's not that many out there. So it makes it really hard to dig deep into these things if you don't speak Japanese well enough to be able to dig in to the sources that you have in Japanese to see what's right and wrong about it. Because this is like everything, everywhere in the world, you have a lot of biases and you have a lot of issues in historiography. And that happens in Japanese historiography of Japan as well, where a lot of times they're not being especially accurate with some things. So it makes it difficult. Also, in the specific case of Japan and other states that were once ruled by horrifically fascistic governments, a lot of documentation is gone, or lost, or misplaced, or burned, or something, or bombed. So there's a lot of stuff that's just we have to piece together if we're going to try and figure out what's happening. So to try and do an accurate game about the Boshin War, you're dealing with very thin sources on the ground. And you now have a film which was fairly popular that has that aesthetic and has that authenticity to it, right? So you're going to pull from that. It makes sense from a game design, selling a product point of view, right?
Alas, here we are. So it just ends up like that, these governments that have a thing to prove, to point, to push, will edit their history to be what they want it to be. Like Mussolini, Hitler did it, Tojo, in Japan did it. Hell, even non like fascistic countries, I would say, have done it as well.
Hmm.
A lot of countries that want to point a nationalist picture of themselves will have, I can't think of the right word for it, perhaps doctored historical sources, or made them just look to be in their favor more, to paint the narrative of what they want to paint.
Yeah.
An idea of the Bushido culture, of American exceptionalism, of what have you. They will take first hand sources and kind of alter them to give that impression of like, this is how things have always been, but that's just how you want things to be now. That isn't always how it has been.
Mm-hmm. And Japan's especially guilty of that with once the rebels won and established the new Meiji government, that search for national images, national identity, and national military culture specifically is why we have this image that we do today, for a large part, right?
Yeah.
Nitobe Inazu's Bushido 1902, 1903, I forget. But that's one of these books written in English for an English audience, trying to explain Bushido in a way that makes understandable to Westerners, but was criticized in Japan and for being this treaty on a largely constructed image of their own past. And of course, that's a continuation of Edo times and this Edo samurai thing we talked about, trying to understand your position in the world. But this is part of that rising government. This is why we have this image. But I don't think it's entirely, how to put this without sounding awful. You're right. Everyone does this all over the place. And it is a part of how people understand their history and their place in the world. That doesn't mean it's correct, but also doesn't mean we should be just being like, well, anything to do with samurai is now bad because it was created in a fascistic period. Or I mean, no, it wasn't. Okay, no, I'm getting tired here. The turn of the century and the construction of the Meiji state is very different from the teens and 20s, and then very, very different from the 30s. And
yeah.
all of that is way too complicated for a discussion on Shogun 2 and the fall of the samurai. But yeah.
I think it is worth noting that both the US and Japan have modern governments born out of direct military conflict, direct rebellions against the government. And I think it is interesting because you can see it echoed as a similar kind of ethos echoed in the Fall of the Samurai DLC, kind of lionizing the rebels, similarly to how you would talk about the Continental Army in the U.S. during the Revolutionary War. It's just like these scrappy fighters standing up against the government, against overwhelming odds and whatever. And while it was true to an extent, that's not necessarily the case, but it fits the narrative of everyone likes the underdog that eventually comes back and wins.
Yeah, I think by the time, like after the first couple fights, they were in a fairly dominant position militarily. And what's interesting to me is they had this, the rebels, part of their rebellion idea was the shogun's not doing his job in ousting the Westerners, right? Not getting rid of the barbarians, not doing his shogun duties. But while they were saying that out loud and attracting, anti-Western patriot types to their side, they were talking to the foreign powers saying, don't worry, when this is all over, we'll still honor all the deals and treaties you had going on with the shogunate. Right? And then as soon as they did take over, they did not expel the barbarians. They kept everything, and they kept talking to them, and they kept learning from them, and building and buying and trading, and created their new state. But guess who the new government was made up of? The young samurai who spearheaded this rebellion. It's just part of how the world works.
Funny how things work out like that. I think that's a pretty good point for us to stop on here today. We're almost 2 hours deep into this now. We've talked a lot about Shogun 2.
Well, that flew by, actually, didn't it?
Huh? Sorry?
That flew by.
Yeah, I mean, I could talk about Shogun 2 all day, and we have talked about Shogun 2 for a decent chunk of it. But yeah, thank you all for tuning in today. If you have any questions, thoughts, comments, concerns, etc., corrections, please let us know in the comments below. Please DM us on Twitter. I'm at Jack_Trumbull. Joe is at Joe Fonseca, Fonseca, Hist, HIST, Joe Fonseca Hist.
Mm-hmm.
Both at twitter.com. Hit us up. complain to us, tell us you liked it, preferably the latter. If you have any thoughts on corrections or anything like that, or ideas for future episodes, or just want to talk to us more about Shogun 2, yeah, hit us up on there. I know I'll be glad to get into a Twitter conversation about Shogun 2.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Oh yeah, 100%. I'm ready and willing to talk about Shogun 2 all day. It is my favorite Total War. If you disagree with me, that's fine, but you're wrong.
We'll do our top 10 list too.
That will be a future episode. Joe, any last thoughts about today?
No, thanks for tuning in. Thanks for sticking with us for an hour and 45 minutes. Always looking forward to comments, always looking forward to corrections, to discussion. Any ideas about what people want in the future, I'm all ears.
Yeah, we have a few ideas coming down the pipe of varying episode lengths. Our next one might be a little bit shorter because we're going to be talking about, I don't know if I want to spoil it. I guess we can cut it out if we don't want to bring it up. But, the myth of the clean Wehrmacht in video games, due to a recent game I reviewed for Wargamer.com, has become a relevant topic again, and I am steamed up and angry about it. And we're probably going to talk about that at some point.
Oh yeah, definitely. I'm up for it, especially given the interesting responses you got on your review, which I wasn't expecting.
There were some interesting... I don't want to talk too much about it. I don't want to get myself booted out of a freelancer position, but people certainly did have some opinions, and boy, were they opinions. That is all I will say about that on here.
It's a spicy topic, and we'll dig into it.
It is spicy 100%. Well, yeah, thank you from us here at Let's Talk About Wargames podcast, and I hope all of you out there listening have a good and safe September. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, everybody.